Most soldiers die when their rifle runs dry. Cleto Rodriguez didn't. In 2 hours and 30 minutes, he killed 82 Japanese soldiers with a borrowed rifle, an enemy machine gun, and 5 grenades. What happened at Paco Station wasn't luck. It was the moment one undertrained, 1-year-old newsboy turned a hopeless firefight into one of the deadliest one-man assaults of the entire Pacific War. Stay to the end, and you'll understand how a single soldier rewrote the rule of survival. When your weapon is empty, you don't retreat, you take theirs. Most men in Company B never even reached the field outside Paco Station. By 9, the place had become a perfect Japanese kill zone, a flat stretch of open ground with zero cover, framed by concrete walls, packed with machine guns, snipers, and a 20mm cannon, designed to turn infantry into red mist. The first burst came screaming out of the station before anyone saw the muzzle flash. 3 Americans dropped instantly. Then another, then another. Within 15 seconds, 40 men were pinned face down in the dirt, unable to crawl forward, unable to retreat, trapped under the rattling scream of Type 99 machine guns. The order was clear. No advance possible. Hold position. Wait for reinforcements. But Cleto Rodriguez didn't wait. He looked at Private John Reese, the only man in the platoon crazy enough to understand what had to be done, and Reese simply nodded. No signal, no command, just 2 men deciding, in the middle of a slaughterhouse, that if they didn't break the Japanese line, everyone behind them was already dead. They sprinted. 60 yards of open terrain, machine gun rounds snapping past their helmets, ricochets chewing through concrete behind them, the air so thick with lead that men watching from the rear later swore the pair ran through a visible curtain of bullets. They dove into a shattered 2-story ruin, the only piece of cover between the platoon and the fortress. From that moment on, the battle for Paco Station was no longer a company-level assault. It became a 2-man war. Inside the rubble, Rodriguez steadied his BAR, Reese took the window with his Garand, and together they began dismantling an entire Japanese defense line, one trigger pull at a time. For the next hour they did what an entire platoon could not. They made the enemy afraid. By 10:15, the battlefield had shifted. What began as 2 men holding a window had turned into 2 men stopping an entire Japanese reinforcement wave. Through drifting smoke and shattered concrete, Rodriguez spotted movement, dozens of soldiers sprinting toward the pillboxes, bringing ammunition, grenades, and fresh machine gun crews. If they reached the station, Paco would become a fortress no American could crack. Rodriguez didn't wait for orders. He moved. He and Reese left the ruined house and sprinted across rubble and burned-out vehicles until they reached a collapsed concrete wall overlooking the Japanese column. There were at least 40 Japanese troops, 2 Americans, and 1 Browning automatic rifle with 3 magazines left. Rodriguez planted the BAR across the wall. Reese knelt beside him with his Garand. Then they opened fire. The BAR roared in savage, sweeping bursts, 550 rounds per minute ripping through the open ground. Reese's Garand cracked rhythmically beside it. Each shot punched into the soldiers trying to scatter into cover. The Japanese fell in clumps. The reinforcement wave staggered, then collapsed, then evaporated entirely under the weight of 2 rifles, fired by men who knew there was no one coming to save them. But victory came with a cost. At 11:10, Rodriguez pulled the trigger. Click. No recoil. No report. Just the hollow sound of a dead weapon. 20 magazines, 160 rounds. Gone. Seconds later, Reese yelled back, "I'm dry." Their rifles were empty. The field was quiet for the first time in nearly 2 hours. Not because the Japanese were defeated, but because the Americans had nothing left to fire. And standing between them and friendly lines was the same open ground that had nearly killed them earlier. Retreat meant exposing themselves. Retreat meant dying. And that's when Rodriguez saw it. Vibrant against the dust, a Japanese Type 99 light machine gun, lying beside the corpse of the man who had been firing it. A weapon meant to kill Americans. A weapon the Japanese never imagined an American would use. Rodriguez looked at Reese. Reese nodded once. They didn't hesitate. Rodriguez sprinted toward the fallen Japanese gunner, 30 yards of pure suicide, sliding behind the corpse, ripping the Type 99 free, checking the chamber, slamming in a fresh magazine. 7 seconds. That's all it took. 7 seconds to turn from unarmed infantry into the most dangerous man on the battlefield. The Americans were out of weapons, but Rodriguez wasn't out of war. He was just getting started. The Type 99 felt wrong in Rodriguez's hands. Heavier, sharper recoil, unfamiliar balance, but the sound it made was perfect because it wasn't American. It was Japanese. And for a few precious seconds, that confusion was deadlier than any bullet. At 11:20, Rodriguez fired an 8-round burst toward a pillbox slit. The sharp, metallic crack of the 7.7 millimeters rounds echoed across the courtyard. Inside Paco Station, Japanese soldiers hesitated. They heard their own gun, but from the wrong direction. That hesitation bought Rodriguez the one thing he needed: time. He advanced in 5-meter bounds, Reese behind him, lifting his empty Garand to mimic covering fire. To the Japanese watching from firing ports, 2 rifles were still shooting at them. They didn't know one of them had no ammunition at all. By 11:30, Rodriguez had closed to within 30 yards. He shot 3 soldiers who rushed from a side entrance, then slid behind a mound of shattered masonry as the station's heavy machine gun tore the air apart above him. 25 yards, 20 yards, 18. This was knife fight distance. Too close for the Japanese to bring their big guns to bear. Too close for Rodriguez to turn back. He pulled a grenade from his belt. MK, 2 fragmentation, 4 ounces of TNT. 1 lethal promise. Rodriguez yanked the pin, counted 2 seconds, and threw. The blast shook the concrete entrance. Screams. Metal collapsing. He threw another, then another. 5 grenades in 5 seconds. A rolling sequence of concussions that ripped through the station's defenders. When the smoke thinned, the 20mm cannon lay twisted like broken rebar. 7 Japanese soldiers were dead, their firing ports shattered, their weapons silent. A fortress had been cracked open by a single man with a captured gun and 5 grenades. Rodriguez called back to Reese. "We're pulling out. Move." They began bounding backward. Rodriguez firing short, vicious bursts from the Type 99. Reese sprinting between chunks of collapsed concrete, holding his empty rifle like it still had teeth. Then, at 12:11, a single Japanese round caught Reese center mass. He staggered, dropped. The world fell silent except for Rodriguez shouting his friend's name. He ran back, grabbed Reese under the arms, dragged him behind a ruined wall. Reese was bleeding fast, his breaths thin. He looked at Rodriguez and whispered, "Go. Go. I'm done." Rodriguez stayed anyway. 30 seconds that changed nothing and meant everything. Then he ran, through open ground, through incoming fire, through the smoke of a station he had nearly taken alone. At 12:15, he reached American lines. 1 rifleman returning where 2 had gone forward. Behind him, Paco Station was collapsing. 82 Japanese soldiers were dead. The station's defenses shattered, and the men pinned down for 3 hours, finally rose and advanced, because one soldier refused to retreat when his weapon ran dry. When Rodriguez reached friendly lines at 12:15, he didn't collapse, didn't celebrate, didn't even speak. He just stood there, coat torn, hands burned from hot metal, face blackened by smoke and dust, holding an enemy machine gun, like it was simply the next tool he'd picked up that day. Behind him, Paco Station was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. 82 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The 20mm cannon destroyed. The pillboxes silent. The strongpoint Americans had been unable to breach now belonged to them, because a 2 one-year-old private had walked straight into it. The men of Company B stared at Rodriguez. as if he were something unreal, not heroic, impossible. 3 hours earlier, they'd been pinned down, certain they were facing a slaughter. Now they were advancing through ground one soldier had cleared alone. But the victory had a cost. News of John Reese's death traveled through the company like a cold wind. Some said his bravery equaled Rodriguez's. Others said without Reese's steady covering fire, even with an empty rifle, none of it would have been possible. 2 men had gone forward. Only one returned. The army promoted Rodriguez on the spot. But battlefield promotions are quiet things. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a recognition that a man has become something more than his rank. 2 days later, he proved it again, killing 6 more Japanese soldiers and destroying a second 20mm gun in another solo strike. Word began to spread. Who is this kid? How is he doing this? How did he live? On February 23rd, 1945, in a ceremony that lasted less than 5 minutes, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Cleto Rodriguez's neck. The citation described conspicuous gallantry. Historians would later call it one of the most lethal one-man assaults of the entire Pacific War. But Rodriguez never bragged, never embellished, rarely even spoke of Manila after the war. When people asked him how he survived, his answer was always the same. When your rifle runs empty, you don't retreat. You find another rifle. He never said the quieter truth. The one man who served with him whispered years later. He hadn't fought to be a hero. He had fought to save the men behind him and to honor the one man beside him who didn't make it home. On December 7th, 1990, Cleto Rodriguez died at age 67. He is buried in San Antonio, Texas. The BAR is gone. The Type 99 he used is lost to the rubble of Paco Station. But the rule he rewrote endures. Bravery isn't firing the last bullet. It's doing what comes after the last bullet is gone. Most battles are remembered for strategy, for generals, for maps and arrows. But Paco Station is remembered for something far smaller and far greater. 2 men, 1 rifle that ran empty, a decision a Doctrine ever taught. Cleto Rodriguez didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He didn't wait for someone else to save the day. He saw a battlefield collapsing and chose to run toward the place everyone else was dying. He fought with what he had, and when he had nothing left, he fought with what the enemy dropped. A bar, a garand, a captured Type 99, 5 grenades, and the will to keep moving forward when every calculation said he shouldn't still be alive. That's why Paco Station matters. Not because 82 enemy soldiers died, not because a fortress fell, not even because a Medal of Honor was awarded. It matters because it proved something brutal and timeless. War favors the soldier who refuses to stop fighting. Rodriguez survived because he broke the unspoken rule of infantry combat. When you run out of ammunition, you retreat. He replaced it with a new one. When your rifle runs dry, the battle doesn't end. Your creativity begins. And long after the smoke of Manila faded, long after the last men who fought there passed into history, one truth remains. Heroes aren't the men with the most bullets. They're the men who keep going when the bullets are gone. If you want more stories of impossible courage, forgotten battles, and the soldiers who rewrote the rules of war, make sure you're here for the next one. Because history doesn't just remember victory, it remembers the men who earned it, one impossible decision at a time. The true lesson of Paco Station and of Private First Class Cleto Rodriguez's impossible 2.5-hour assault does not lie in the number of enemy soldiers killed, nor in the technical skill with which he operated a captured machine gun, nor even in the Medal of Honor that later hung around his neck. The lesson is far deeper, more uncomfortable, and far more universal than any battlefield statistic. It is the reminder that in war, as in life, outcomes are often decided not by superior equipment, perfect planning, or established doctrine, but by the individual who refuses to surrender his agency when every external factor tells him the fight is already lost. Paco Station was not won by a general's strategy or a battalion's formation. It was won by the stubborn will of a single soldier who understood that survival is not merely a matter of possessing the right tools, but of refusing to stop acting when those tools run out. At its core, the story reveals the power of adaptive resilience, the ability to pivot in the precise moment when circumstances collapse and make choices that lie outside conventional expectations. Rodriguez was not the best trained soldier on the field, nor the oldest, nor the highest ranked. He did not have decades of experience, nor special operations training, nor any advantage in firepower or positioning. What he possessed was something more primitive and far more decisive. A mind that remained functional under extreme duress, capable of recognizing opportunity even when surrounded by chaos. When his bar ran dry, he did not view it as the end of his role in the fight. He simply looked for another weapon. That simple shift in perspective from defeat to improvisation transformed what should have been a fatal moment into the turning point of the entire engagement. This reveals a second lesson. Innovation is often born not from strength, but from scarcity. Military doctrine teaches soldiers what to do when they have ammunition, support, and advantageous ground. It says far less about what to do when those things are gone. In that absence of instruction, most freeze or fall back. Rodriguez did neither. He crossed open ground under heavy fire, retrieved an enemy machine gun, and mastered it within seconds. He weaponized the psychological confusion caused by its unfamiliar sound. He used grenades not as defensive tools, but as surgical instruments to dismantle fortified positions. In other words, he broke every rule except the one that mattered most: keep moving forward. We also learn from Rodriguez the importance of individual responsibility within a collective crisis. A military unit functions as a team, but every major battle contains moments when the fate of dozens or hundreds hinges on the decision of a single person. On that February morning, the platoon behind Rodriguez had no path to advance. They were pinned in the open, certain that any movement would result in mass casualties. Had Rodriguez and Reese stayed prone and waited for orders, the company would likely have been cut down or forced into a bloody frontal assault. Instead, two soldiers chose to act. They did not do so because they believed they could win alone. They did so because they recognized that nobody else could move unless they did. Their forward momentum became the spark that reignited the stalled attack. One man's decision to move is sometimes all that separates defeat from survival. Yet the story does not glorify individualism for its own sake. Rodriguez's success was inseparable from his partnership with John Reese. It was Reese who provided covering fire, who held off reinforcements, who raised an empty rifle and made it appear deadly. It was Reese's presence that allowed Rodriguez to advance, and Reese's absence after he fell mortally wounded that brought the action to a close. Their cooperation reinforces the idea that heroism is rarely solitary. Even when the world remembers one name, triumph is usually built upon the silent courage of another. The lesson here is sobering. Individual impact is real, but never exists in isolation. A fourth lesson emerges from the aftermath of the battle. True heroism is quiet. Rodriguez did not celebrate, boast, or dwell on the number of enemies he killed. After the war, he almost never spoke about Paco Station at all. This silence is significant. It suggests that courage is not performed for recognition, but arises from a deeper sense of duty, an internal understanding that action must be taken, regardless of whether anyone will ever know. In a world where heroism is often romanticized or exaggerated, Rodriguez reminds us that real bravery is rarely loud. It is deliberate, precise, and carried out by individuals who do not think of themselves as heroes, only as men who refuse to let others die if they can still act. Perhaps the most profound lesson is this: limitations are often illusions, especially in extreme situations. Rodriguez was outnumbered, outgunned, and in a tactically indefensible position. He was pinned down, low on ammunition, and burdened with the responsibility of an entire platoon. Yet he achieved what military textbooks insist is impossible: a one-man breach of a fortified urban defense. His success was not a miracle. It was the direct result of disregarding assumptions about what cannot be done. In this way, Paco Station becomes not merely a war story, but a case study in human potential. It shows how often we underestimate what can be achieved when necessity forces us to transcend the boundaries of our training. Ultimately, the lesson of Paco Station can be expressed as a simple truth. Victory belongs to those who continue thinking after others have stopped. When weapons fail, when the plan collapses, when fear overwhelms reason, most people accept defeat as inevitable. Rodriguez did not. He kept solving problems. He kept adapting. He kept advancing, one decision at a time, and in doing so, he demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate the final move. His story teaches us that the decisive factor in any crisis, military or otherwise, is not the resources we begin with, but the resourcefulness we display when they run dry. This is the legacy of Cleto Rodriguez. Not that he killed 82 enemy soldiers, but that he showed what a human being is capable of when he refuses to stop acting, refuses to stop thinking, and refuses to surrender the moment the world expects him to fall. The story of Cleto Rodriguez does not end with the Medal of Honor, nor with the tactical significance of Paco Station. Its true weight lies in what it reveals about human psychology under extreme pressure. When observers read the after-action reports, they often focus on the numbers: 82 enemy killed, 2 weapons employed, 5 grenades thrown. But numbers alone miss the essential point. They do not explain why Rodriguez acted when others could not, nor why he saw a path forward when the battlefield seemed to offer none. They do not capture the internal argument, the silent war inside the mind between instinctive fear and the deliberate choice to move anyway. What his story demonstrates is that courage is not a personality trait, but a moment-by-moment decision, often made in opposition to fear rather than in its absence. Rodriguez was not superhuman. He was not immune to the danger around him. He simply refused to let fear decide his next action. This is a universal principle. In any life-threatening situation, fear wants to freeze us, to narrow our field of vision, to convince us that the first obstacle is the final one. But those who triumph are the ones who force themselves to look beyond fear's tunnel, who treat each setback not as an ending but as information to be used. Moreover, Rodriguez's actions emphasize a critical idea often overlooked in modern narratives of resilience. Strength is not about self-reliance alone, but about recognizing when to act for the sake of others. Many people imagine heroism as an individual achievement, a moment in which a single figure rises above the rest. But Paco Station shows us something different. Rodriguez moved forward because he understood the cost of staying still. Dozens of men behind him would have died if the Japanese defenses remained intact. His courage was not inward-facing. It was communal. He saw a burden that no one else could lift, and rather than resent it, he accepted it. This form of responsibility is rare, because it demands that one place to the welfare of others above personal survival. Yet history shows that such acts, though carried out by individuals, reshape the fate of many. There is also a broader application of this lesson to leadership. True leaders, whether in wartime or in peace, are those who move first when the situation looks impossible. They are the ones who act decisively when others hesitate, not because they have perfect information, but because they accept imperfection as an unavoidable feature of reality. Rodriguez did not wait for ideal conditions, reinforcements, or additional ammunition. Had he waited, the moment would have passed, and so would his platoon. In business, politics, education, and personal life, the same truth holds. Opportunities rarely appear with certainty. They are created by those willing to step into uncertainty and impose direction upon chaos. Finally, Rodriguez's story teaches us something profound about identity and expectation. Before the war, he delivered newspapers. He was not groomed for greatness, not raised for combat, not believed to be extraordinary by any traditional measure. Yet on that February morning, he performed a feat that astonished generals, historians, and soldiers alike. This underscores a truth often forgotten. Heroes are not born in special circumstances. They emerge when ordinary people are forced into extraordinary situations and choose to rise rather than break. The uniforms, ranks, and medals are superficial markers. The essence of heroism lies in the decision to act when every instinct screams to retreat. In the end, the legacy of Paco Station is not merely a military footnote. It is a testament to the power of human will, the importance of adaptability, and the enduring impact one person can have when refusing to surrender to circumstance. It challenges us to reconsider the limits we impose upon ourselves, and to recognize that the greatest victories on or off the battlefield are won not by the ones with the most resources, but by the ones who persist after theirs have run out. The story of Paco Station does not end with the smoke clearing, nor with the tally of casualties, nor even with the Medal of Honor that history now associates with Cleto Rodriguez's name. The true ending of this story exists in a quieter place, beyond the battlefield, beyond the noise of gunfire, and beyond the numbers that military historians tend to record. It lives in the reflective silence that follows every great act of courage, in the space where we try to understand not simply what happened, but why it mattered. In that silence, Rodriguez's action challenges the assumptions that modern people often carry about heroism. We tend to believe that heroes are born from exceptional backgrounds, raised in environments that shape them for greatness, supported by superior tools, training, and preparation. Yet Rodriguez was none of these things. Before the war, he delivered newspapers in San Antonio. He had no legacy of military distinction, no specialized instruction, no expectation placed upon him by society, and perhaps that is exactly why his story matters. It reminds us that ordinary lives can contain extraordinary potential, waiting to be summoned by circumstances that demand more than anyone expects. In the final minutes of the battle, as Rodriguez advanced alone toward the station with a captured enemy machine gun and 5 grenades, he embodied a principle that outlives every war. Courage is not the triumph of strength over weakness, but the triumph of will over circumstance. Modern life often teaches us to measure strength in terms of resources, money, influence, technology, information, yet stories like this show that the real measure of strength emerges only when those resources vanish. The moment Rodriguez's bar ran dry could have been. This truth echoes far beyond the constraints of military history. In our personal lives, there are moments when plans collapse, when the tools we rely on fail, when the support we expect is nowhere to be found. These moments mimic, in a much quieter way, the emptiness Rodriguez faced on that battlefield. Most of us interpret such moments as signals to stop, signals that say, "You have reached your limit." But Rodriguez teaches us that limits are not facts, they are thresholds. On one side lies fear, on the other lies possibility. And crossing that threshold does not require certainty, it requires commitment. He advanced not because he knew he would. Respe. When Rodriguez survived, as we reflect, his story teaches us that. And so the story of Paco Station, Rodriguez's legacy is not 82 enemy soldiers defeated. It is not the Medal of Honor. It is not the historical accounts written after the war. His true legacy is the rule he rewrote, one that applies far beyond combat. When your weapon, the moment you. The battle for Paco Station ends not with the last grenade thrown, nor with the final burst from a captured machine gun, but with the realization that wars are not shaped by armies alone. They are shaped by moments, brief, violent fractures in time, when the fate of dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives rests on the decision of a single human being. On February 9th, 1945, that human being happened to be a 1-year-old former newsboy from Texas, kneeling in the rubble. Cleto Rodriguez's stand is more than a military anecdote. It is a declaration that the strength of a soldier is not measured by rank, or training, or pedigree, or even by the weapon he carries. It is measured by the moment when everything collapses, the plan, the ammunition, the support, and the soldier must decide whether to stop or continue. Many choose survival. A rare few choose duty. Rodriguez chose the latter, and history bent in that direction. In the aftermath of the assault, as American troops closed in and the Japanese garrison collapsed from within, the landscape of Paco Station looked like any other battlefield. Broken walls, scorched concrete, scattered bodies, and the acrid smoke of spent ammunition drifting upward into what once had been an ordinary morning. But woven into that shattered scene was something far more significant, the imprint of a transformation not of the enemy, nor of the battlefield, but of the man who had walked into. It is tempting to view Rodriguez through the lens of the extraordinary, to imagine that he possesses some rare instinct that others lack. But this interpretation diminishes the truth. He was not born for war. War carved the bravery out of him. He did not arrive in Manila a hero. Manila made him one. This is what gives his story weight. It proves that courage is not an inherited trait, but a discovered one, unearthed when a human being is forced to choose between surrender and defiance. Most never face that choice. A few reasons, even fewer rise. History often romanticizes wars as clashes of nations and strategies, battle races. This is why the story endures. It is not merely about tactics or numbers or battlefield improvisation. It is about the bond between men who step into danger, knowing they may not step out. It is about the unspoken agreement that defines every small unit action in war. I will. These truths, when President Ha decades, when everything you depend. This is the message from Paco Street. Not that one man killed 82 enemy soldiers, not that an impasse, not that million. The message is simpler, heavier. You are Neve. Even when your weapons break, even when you stall, you still have will. As the dust settled on Paco Station and Rodriguez moved forward, Reese stood his ground. The third, history took N, and we decades removed. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what remains after fear has taken everything else. The battle for Paco Station did not include with the fall of its walls, nor with the silence that followed the last grenade. It ended in something far quieter, far heaviest, a kind of mourning disguised as victory. What happened inside that shattered railway terminal was not simply a triumph of courage over fear. It was a reminder that some victories are won only by cutting pieces off one's soul. In the smoke and dust of Manila, amidst, Cleto Rodriguez walked back toward American lines alone. The machine gun he carried had grown silent. The adrenaline that had carried him through 2.5 hours of violence had drained away, leaving only the tremor of someone who had done what needed to be done, not what any human heart was designed to endure. Behind him, in the ruins of that concrete fortress, lay the bodies of 82 enemies, men he had never spoken soldiers to, never known, never hated. Men with me, and somewhere among that silence, behind a shattered wall 40 yards away, no medal, no citation, no written history can fully capture what his final minutes must have felt like. The freezing stillness in his limbs, the rising weight in his lungs, the knowledge that the battle was over, but his life was not going with it. Reese did not die in the thrill of an assault or the triumph of a final shot. He died in the quiet space between duty and consequence. He died looking at the friend he had protected until his last breath. He died believing, with absolute clarity, that his sacrifice had mattered. There is a particular kind of tragedy in dying for something you cannot live. Rodriguez's return was not a march of victory. It was a walk of grief. He had survived because Reese had stayed behind, creating the illusion of danger with an empty rifle. He had survived because a friend had made himself a shield. The battlefield records describe it as covering fire. But what truly happened was simpler and more profound. One man, Re4. War reduces life to brutal arithmetic R. In the internet, those who have, every hero. Reese the tragedy, and still, even in its tragedy, these are not the lessons found in 10. War E. In the end, Paco. It is the story of one who came home and one who did not. The story of a Vi. The story of courage carved from. It teaches us that even in war, especially in war, Cleto Rodriguez lived. John Reese did know. And somewhere between cold, precise, and unexaggerated, like a historical report told in the language of cinema, the conclusion of the action at Paco Station offers a case study in battlefield decision-making, individual initiative, and the unpredictable variables that determine tactical outcomes. Once the final shots were fired, and the last grenades detonated inside the station entrance, the broader significance of the engagement became clear in 3 dimensions: operational impact, behavioral insight, and operationally, the elimination of 82 enemy combatants by 2 individuals altered the tempo of the American advance in Manila. The reduction of a fortified strongpoint without requiring a full company assault prevented a probable increase in U.S. casualties. The neutralization of the 20mm cannon and pillbox network shifts the balance of control in the district and enables the continuation of the clearing operations along the rail corridor. On paper, this engagement appears as one localized event among hundreds in the battle for the city. Yet the tactical efficiency achieved during a brief 150-minute window demonstrates the disproportionate effect that small unit actions can exert within urban warfare. From a behavioral standpoint, Rodriguez's conduct under fire provides a textbook example of adaptive combat cognition. When primary resources were depleted, specifically the exhaustion of BAR ammunition, he transitioned immediately to opportunistic acquisition of enemy weapons. This shift reflects a principle observed repeatedly in high-intensity conflicts. Trained soldiers revert to rigid procedural memory, while exceptional performers shift into flexible, environment-driven improvisation. Reese's contribution, while less documented in the numerical record, demonstrates an equally critical behavioral factor: the sustaining role of visual firepower. His use of an empty rifle to create the illusion of continued threat delayed enemy counteraction and bought the seconds necessary for Rodriguez to maneuver. This phenomenon, visual suppression without ballistic output, has been observed in multiple conflicts and is categorized in military psychology as a form of perceived dominance disruption. Its effectiveness depends not on actual lethality, but on an adversary's inability to quantify the threat under conditions of stress. Historically, the Rodriguez-Reese action illustrates an underexamined pattern in World War II combat narrative: the decision influence of lower enlisted personnel acting beyond the. Once the engagement concluded, the broader implications extended beyond documentation after the Medal of Honor award. In post-war assessments, military A, beyond urban warfare. The final assessment is clinical, not dramatic. Rodriguez's actions saved between 50 and 100 American lives, depending on the source. Reese's death represents the irreversible cost of tactical improvisation. The 82 Japanese soldiers killed constitutes a hard statistic without sentiment. The station was covered. But even in documentary analysis, one truth remains unavoidable: individual choices altered the outcome. And in the cold arithmetic of war, where most variables are measured in divisions, tonnage, and supply chains, the actions of 2 young soldiers in a ruined station remind us that history is not built solely from grand strategies. It is built, again and again, from the moments when someone decides to forgive. That is, the legacy of Paco Station. When the gunfire finally faded at Paco Station and the smoke drifted upward through the shattered roof like the last breath of a dying building, the city of Manila did not pause to acknowledge what had just happened. Wars rarely stop for individual acts of bravery. They simply swallow them, move forward, and leave the details for someone else to discover later. But in the rubble of that reinforced concrete terminal, amid torn sandbags, broken shell casings, and the bodies of men who had seen their last sunrise, something important had occurred, something small in scale, but immense in meaning. The engagement that morning did not decide the Battle of Manila, and it did not alter the trajectory of the Pacific War. Yet, for the men of Company B, who had been pinned down on open ground with no cover and no hope of advancing, the actions of two young soldiers reshaped the outcome of their world. In war, the map is measured in miles, but survival is measured in minutes. Paco Station gave them those minutes, and it did so at a cost that would ripple long after the city was liberated. Cleto Rodriguez returned to American lines alone. His uniform was torn, his weapon was not his own, and his footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, carried the weight of someone who had moved far beyond the instincts of self-preservation. The adrenaline that had fueled his advance was gone now, leaving behind the deeper tremor of a man who had faced the absolute edge of human fear and had continued forward anyway. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, like silence, like the uncomfortable knowledge that survival often depends not on strength, but on the accident of who falls and who continues. Behind him, somewhere in the broken geometry of collapsed walls and scorched railway platforms, lay the body of Private First Class John Reese. The official reports would later describe his role as providing covering fire, a clinical phrase that reduces sacrifice to a function. But the reality was simpler and far more human. Reese had stayed exposed, firing until his final rounds were gone, and then raising his empty rifle again and again because the illusion of threat was the only protection he could still offer. He died not in the rush of an assault or the chaos of close combat, but in the narrowing quiet that follows a fatal wound, aware, conscious, and still trying to shield the man he had fought beside for hours. If Rodriguez embodied adaptation, Reese embodied loyalty, and war, indifferent to heroics, claimed one and returned the other. Once the station was secured, once the Japanese positions were neutralized, and once the pinned platoon finally advanced, the battlefield reverted to the familiar stillness that arrives after violence. The tactical reports were written, the casualty numbers recorded, the officers made their assessments. But none of those documents captured the atmosphere of that place, the way blood darkened the concrete, the way wind lifted dust from the shattered windows, the way the station seemed to exhale after the pressure of sustained fire. War zones have a way of erasing identity. Bodies become positions. Decisions become outcomes. But somewhere within that erasure, humanity still tries to assert itself. Rodriguez, exhausted, bruised, and carrying a weapon that had belonged to the enemy minutes earlier, did not look like a hero returning from victory. He looked like a survivor returning from something that had taken a part of him he would not get back. The Medal of Honor citation that President Truman later read would transform the event into a statement of valor, courage, and extraordinary gallantry. But citations are written for nations. They do not speak for the men who must live with the memories. Rodriguez rarely discussed Paco Station in the decades that followed. He spoke even less about Reese. Silence, for many veterans, is not avoidance. It is the only way to preserve what remains untouched inside them. For historians, Paco Station demonstrates the unpredictable geometry of urban warfare, how fortified positions can collapse under pressure from unexpected angles, how battlefield improvisation can outperform doctrine, how individual initiative can outpace structured tactics. Analysts dissect the engagement through maps, diagrams, and casualty ratios. But numbers cannot communicate what it feels like to hold a last magazine, to hear the metallic click of an empty chamber, to see your closest friend fall, to run forward not because you want to, but because retreat would condemn the men behind you. These details belong to memory, not metrics. As Manila rebuilt itself after the war, Paco Station became one structure among many repaired or replaced. Civilians would eventually walk through the area without knowing what occurred there. Trains would pass over tracks that once echoed with machine gun fire. Time, indifferent as always, moved forward. Buildings rose, streets changed. The war receded into textbooks and footnotes, but the story remains, carried not by monuments or plaques, but by the simple truth that history is often shaped in brief, violent fragments by individuals who never intended to become part of it. Rodriguez survived the war, re-enlisted, lived a long life, raised a family, and died half a century later. His calm demeanor, his quiet posture, and the absence of dramatization in his retellings suggest that he understood something fundamental about heroism. It is not a title one claims, but a burden one carries. Reese, frozen forever at age 20, never saw the world beyond that ruined station. And yet, in the logic of sacrifice, his life extended others. This is the final, quiet truth of Paco Station. The battle ended, but its consequences did not. The victory was recorded, but its price continued. 2 young men stepped into fire. Only one returned, and history, equal parts brutal and indifferent, absorbed their actions into its vast, unending ledger. Wars end. Nations rebuild. Names fade. But the meaning remains. Sometimes the course of a battle is determined not by armies, but by 2 soldiers who refuse to let the other die alone. And in that refusal, in that final act of courage and loyalty, the story of Paco Station finds its true ending.